All right, so we're picking back up color theory notes where we left off yesterday. So right underneath where we wrote primary, secondary, tertiary, we're gonna build up a little bit of other color theory vocabulary here. So we've already talked about color being the reflected light, really anything in the visible light spectrum. And a lot of times the word color is used interchangeably with hue. And the difference is color is kind of this umbrella term that covers really everything we're talking about here. Hue refers to the specific name of like the pure color that's on the light spectrum. So it's going to be those simple names, the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. So kind of the name of the color family. Okay, and then let's write down chroma. So chroma is going to be the purity of the color, or the purity. When I say purity of the color, I mean like how close is it to the hue? Like when you think of blue, how close is it to this? It's kind of like the flavor of a color. So if you start to desaturate a color, like mix it with really anything, you're gonna change the purity of that color. So it's no longer gonna be have like a high chroma or an intense chroma. It's gonna get a little less intense. Then let's do achromatic. Achromatic is going to be an absence of chroma. This is going to be the black, white, and gray. And then saturation refers to the intensity of the color. So the saturation, similar to kind of talking about chroma, but it's different. They're very closely related. Is gonna refer to how much black, white, or gray is mixed into something. If there's a lot of black, white, or gray mixed into a color, it's gonna be desaturated, where if it's really just hues mixed together, then we're gonna have like a much higher saturation. Also good to note that neutral colors are not included within hues. Those are just gonna be in the achromatic or in a separate category of neutrals, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, and then Now, all of you are very familiar with value, lightness and darkness of a color. And within value, there's a few things I want to talk about here specifically. So I'm going to go ahead and have you guys paint a little value scale with black. So you can use your Payne's gray for this. Not very often I'm going to ask you to use black on anything. And you get a little bit of practice and saturation right here. So whenever you're trying to get a really high saturation of paint on your brush, you're really going to load that brush up, use a little bit of water, and keep getting more pigment on there. You can get the darker value here. I'm just going to outline for white here. So we have like a pretty broad range of values here. Now, a lot of times people assume that to impact value, you have to add black, white, or gray, and that's not true. Every hue kind of has its own value range. So I want you to take a few of the paints you have, and I just want you to kind of match where it is on this value range. So I'm gonna check, let's see. Cadmium red, I'm just gonna get it on my brush. And I'm gonna put it on there at a pretty high saturation. So I'm gonna compare directly to what's on my brush, and I'm going to say that its value is pretty close to right here. And it can be lightened by either adding white or making it less saturated with more water. So, let's see. And then let's compare with a yellow. The lemon yellow is really close to like the pure white as far as value goes. And again, these can be lightened or darkened with a lot of different things. Okay, and then I'm also going to draw just a little quick diagram in relationship to value that many of you have probably seen before. So if we have just a sphere and a light shining on that sphere coming from this direction, where the light hits it is going to be called a direct highlight. And then in here, you're going to have some midtones. And then around here is going to be probably your darkest value on here. And this is what's called the core shadow. You're going to have another layer of midtones. And then down here is going to be a reflected highlight. So what's happening with the reflected highlight is the light that's coming from your light source over here is coming down and bouncing off of whatever surface that this ball is sitting on, and then it's hitting the back of it again here. This light bounces around. Okay, and then down here is going to be the cast shadow. Okay, and then I'm gonna do this again with paint just underneath it to not mess it up here. Let's do paying attention to values really early on in the process of painting a still life with watercolor is really important, because again, unlike a lot of the more opaque paints, you can't just cover all of this up. You have to kind of plan ahead where you want those highlights. And you can always use masking if you want to kind of prevent yourself from covering it up. So if I want to get that direct highlight, and then go ahead and add right here for a reflected highlight. Conveniently the same color as the masking, is the same color as the paint that I was using. And then I'll come back and peel the masking off when it's dry there. And then just kind of along with value, a few other vocab words here. Going to be tint, which is adding white to a color. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to mix white pigment in with it. It could just be that you're keeping that layer of watercolor paint transparent so that some of the white of the paper is showing through it. Shade is going to be adding black to a color. And it's really common to say like the phrase like, what shade of blue do you like? And I would encourage you to try to shift to saying like what color of blue, because it's a little bit different, because wherever we're talking about shade, you're talking specifically about something that's darker by adding black. I mean, in everyday life, by all means, keep saying it, but in painting class, it gets a little bit confusing. So then in tone, it's going to be adding gray. Okay. And then I think this is a good spot to switch to a new piece of paper on mine. You're welcome to keep working on this piece if you've worked a little smaller and have more room. Or if yours is dry, if you're kind of working on this in parts, you're welcome to flip over to the back. Okay. So from here, I'm going to start talking about color harmonies. Color harmonies are just combinations of colors using patterns on the color wheel. Okay, the first one is going to be monochromatic. Which means you're just using one hue plus white and black. And for this part, I want everyone to get just kind of a simple, solid-ish colored object, nothing too complicated. For mine, I'm just going to use this orange. And let's see, let's use, I'm going to use my ultramarine blue. Again, I'm really lightly kind of drawing things out the paintbrush so I can plan to leave highlights. I've got my light hitting the orange right here, so I'm going to kind of plan to leave that. Sometimes outlining it is helpful. Or I can go in and do a little bit of masking. Get a little texture in there. So a monochromatic color scheme is really heavily going to focus on value. The next of the color harmonies is going to be analogous. And that's going to be 3 to 5 colors that are right next to each other on the color wheel. I'm gonna have everyone throw just like a quick little color wheel under each one of these so that we can draw out the pattern. And you do not have to do it on the monochromatic one, but I am going to anyway. And this does not need to be a complicated color wheel like we did yesterday on part 1 of the color notes. But it does need to have primary, secondary, and the tertiary colors. be easiest if I just did all of these at the same time. I'm gonna write these out first and then go back in and paint. So we've got analogous, so the 3 to 5 colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. Then we've got complementary. And that's going to be colors opposite each other on the color wheel. The split complementary is going to be a color plus the 2 colors adjacent to its complement. Okay, and the last one I'm going to include on here is triadic. There are more, but these ones are the basics. So triadic is going to be 3 colors that are equidistant on the wheel. And I missed one of my yellow greens. Okay. Okay, so analogous is going to be 3 to 5 colors on the color wheel that are right next to each other. So for this one, let's do and you can choose any analogous color scheme for yours. So again, I'm going to start off paying attention to where my highlights are. And since I have some colors to choose from here, I'm going to start with my pigment that's already the lightest. And just kind of blocking out where I kind of want to keep things white and kind of mapping out what I'm painting. And just because I'm trying to get this laid out fast, I didn't really wait for that masking to dry, so I'll lift out some highlights. Okay. And then complementary is going to be colors right across from each other on the color wheel. So for this one, I'm going to use blue and orange. And I'm going to talk a lot about complementary pairs and what happens with those later on. Oop. Obviously, I do not expect these to be detailed. I just want you to get a little tiny chance to paint from life for each of these in kind of a non-committal way. I'm just going back into the analogous one a little bit as certain layers are drying. Okay. And then for the split complementary, it's gonna be one color, and then you're gonna go on opposite sides of its complement. So I'm gonna go for the yellow orange, and then so directly across from yellow orange is gonna be the blue violet. So on either side of the blue violet, we're gonna split off. We're not gonna use blue violet, but we're gonna use violet, and we're gonna use blue. So you're always gonna pick whichever color first, go directly across, and then look at its neighbors. If you don't have like a very good circle, you might want to count and make sure whichever one you're choosing is actually the one that's supposed to be directly across from it. Then violet. Some blue. And I am going to talk a little bit later about how I'm choosing where I'm putting some of these colors. I'm going to let that dry and then go back in with a glaze of the yellow orange. Then triadic is going to be 3 colors that are equidistant. So you're basically going to create a triangle. So that could be your primaries. It could be your secondary colors. It could also be, you know, some random tertiary colors. So maybe I'm going to go the yellow green and then the red orange and the blue violet. Some options there. I think I am just gonna go, I think I'm gonna go with the secondaries here. Another tip, the bigger brush you work with, the faster your painting is going to come together, and it's probably going to look a little bit more painterly and a little less like a drawing. I've always gotten the advice to use one paintbrush size larger than what feels comfortable. Go ahead and go over with my yellow orange here again. Go back in with the orange in here. And lift. Okay, got some examples with color harmonies there. The next thing I'm going to talk about is temperature. Okay. Separate that. So, whenever we look at a color wheel, usually it's pretty easy to kind of divide in half and say this half is warm, this half is cool. And that's kind of what we learn early on. But like many things, temperature is relative. So I'm going to use the word relative a lot, both in talking about temperature and about value. And we're also going to talk about it with one other little section of notes later. But when I say relative, I just mean when you're comparing two things, one is going to be a little bit warmer than the others in terms of temperature. So go ahead and so typically we think of the red, orange, and yellow as warm, and kind of in that order. Red's the warmest, then orange, and then yellow. And then under the cool colors, usually we're thinking blue first, and then green, and then violet. But when we're starting to talk about relative temperature, and we have two different reds, so let's get our alizarin crimson down here. And then our cadmium red. Our cadmium red is the warmer red. And then alizarin crimson is going to be the cooler one. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep it on this chart so we can keep them separate. And then with our yellow, we've got our lemon yellow on the cooler half. And our cadmium yellow on the warmer half. For the greens, the sap green is going to be your warmer green. Viridian is going to be the colder. Oops, I mixed them up. Viridian green goes on the cold side. And sap green on the warmer. And then for the blue, the ultramarine is the warmer. And the phthalo is going to be on the cooler. And then with the browns, burnt sienna is going to be the warmer. And umber is going to be the cooler. Go ahead and label those. I'm just kind of following along with the key that I made previously. So whenever you're looking at something and trying to kind of determine whether it's going to be the warmer side of that hue or the cooler side of that hue, sometimes it gets a little tricky, especially with blues. I think that's the one that I hear students mix up the most whenever they're looking at them. A lot of people tend to think ultramarine is the cooler one. The best way that I know how to describe it is, imagine that you have an object that is this color. So say I have a ball that is that color, so, or that hue. So I have a red ball or a yellow ball or green and blue, and under the sunlight it might look a little bit more like this, but under like a cold fluorescent light it might look a little bit more like this. And I actually think I've got a few things where I can show you. Give me one sec. So I am going to line up. They're going to want to roll all over the place. I'm going to try to keep them here. Whoop. So right now, the light I have on this is a fairly neutral light, but I do have the ability to kind of switch the tone. So if I'm switching to a cool light, they start to look a little bit more like the colors under our cool side here. Now if I switch to a warm light, they look a little bit more like our warm side. And switch back to the neutral. So temperature is going to be really, really important whenever we're looking at drawing from, or painting from life. So we're going to use that same diagram again, except we're going to fully do it in color. And I'm going to have one of these here as a reference. Hopefully you guys can see that. Let me look at the screen real quick. Okay. Adjust the light a little bit, just. Okay, so we've got our light source coming from over here, and then I'm going to switch it to a cool light. So something that I want you to notice about how the temperature of the light impacts what you're seeing here. So not only is that going to tell us that we're probably going to use a little bit more of the cooler green if we're painting this, but I also want you to look at how the shadow changes when I change the light. So with the cool light, the shadow of this is kind of orange. So the light being kind of blue, the shadow's kind of orange. When the light is kind of yellowish, the shadow's kind of purple. And this light, it's a little bit more neutral. It's still kind of on the cold side of neutral, and we're still getting a little bit more warmth in the shadow. So we've got cool light, warm shadow. When we have a warm light, we have a cool shadow. And that is always going to be the case. So Just get the base of the color down. And I'm going to do 2 of these. So on this one, we're going to do the warm light. This one we're going to do the cool light. And we're going to assume the warm light is going to be a little bit more yellow. The cool light's going to be a little bit more blue. So with that yellow warm light, a few things need to happen. I need to show that on this sphere, there's warmth hitting these highlights here, and my highlights are going to be warmer. So I'm going to just go in, I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to go in with a little bit of warm green, and I can always glaze over with yellow if I want to. And don't forget, we've got reflected highlights coming from our surface. Can't see them from the camera angle, but the white is reflecting off of here, kind of leaving a little bit of a highlight there. And keep in mind the color of the ball itself is kind of a cold green in a neutral lighting. And you don't want to ignore that just because I'm adding on some warm light. You still want it to reflect as a cold color with a warm light hitting it. That might be something where you choose to go with your cooler yellow to kind of show the warm light hitting. Because again, while this is a colder yellow than this yellow, it's still on the warm side of the color spectrum. Okay, and then we've got a colder shadow. And not only is the shadow always the opposite temperature of the light, it's also the opposite color. It is always going to be the complement of the color of that light. And for those of you who kind of mentioned in your intro that you're interested in painting landscapes, that's something that's really important to keep in mind. If you have an overcast day, things are going to look a lot more realistic and make a little bit more sense if you have warmer brown shadows on an overcast day versus on a sunny day, you're going to have cold shadows that are probably blue and purple. And then again, I'm gonna lift for some of the highlights and reflections. Again, don't need to go too crazy detail into this for notes. I just want you to have kind of a visual representation. Okay, now I'm going to switch to the cool light. And again, so the shadow's starting to go kind of like orange and brown. I'm going to go back on here, make this really look like there's cool light hitting it. I might kind of go in with some blue in the highlighted areas. And it's not just the cast shadow that's going to be the opposite. It's also going to be the core shadow, which I actually didn't even add into here. I'm going to go ahead and do that really quick. There's also going to be some purple and blue in here. Okay, and then where the cool light is, those shadows are going to be warmer. I'm going to get in here with some burnt umber. And then getting some warmth in the shadows. It's going to be while watercolor does have a mind of its own and really wants to do its own thing, it is also pretty forgiving, so there is that. Okay. Just adding the note that the shadow and the light are always going to be complementary. And so it is really important to memorize your complementary pairs. Go back to the more neutral light. There we go. So again, complements are colors opposite each other on the color wheel. And so the main complementary pairs are going to be red and green, blue and orange, and then yellow and violet. And again, you really need to memorize these pairs if you haven't already. They are going to be very, very helpful. So not only is that something you need to know in paying attention to light, but this is also how we're going to make what's called a chromatic neutral. Now, when we say neutral, there's a lot of colors that come to mind. Sometimes you might kind of include black, white, and gray in there. And then kind of like the browns and beiges. But something I want you to pay attention to specifically is this word chromatic. If you remember previously in our notes, we talked about achromatic, being the colors that are the black, white, and gray, lacking chroma. So these are going to be neutrals that you make by mixing chromas. So we're going to use our blending feathering technique to kind of make a scale of each of these where you get the neutral in the middle. And I don't care which version of these colors you use. Just lay down our red. And a green. And then I'm gonna kind of feather my way into blending these. And there's going to be a lot of times where you're going to want this transparency of the paint, but I want you to go really opaque here. So kind of load up your brush. So I really want you to see in full saturation what happens when these colors mix. Okay, now we're going to do one that's the blue and orange. And then one with the yellow and violet. Mix up the violet real quick. So essentially, in creating neutrals, it's going to be some combination of all three of the primaries mixing together, because we've got red and then green is made up of the yellow and blue. So we've got all three primaries. Same with this one. We've got blue and then the orange is made up of the yellow and red, and so on. And this is where I want you to avoid using black or Payne's gray almost completely. Not to say it doesn't have its place, but you're always going to have a painting that is a lot more vibrant whenever you're using chromatic neutrals rather than achromatic neutrals. So if you need to use black, for example, the quickest shortcut is adding your blues and browns together. So browns kind of have an orange tint, so it is still complementary, but it's already been kind of neutralized a little bit. So I'm just gonna off to the side show you. Have my phthalo blue there, and then I'm gonna take some burnt umber, and right now I see that's a little bit green, and so I want to neutralize from green so I can add a little bit of red because that's the complement. And that's kind of a red violet. So complements of red and violet are gonna be yellow green. So I'm gonna take the yellow green and mix it in there. I'm going with more blue. And it takes a while to kind of get the right combination, but eventually you can get to blacks that actually have a temperature. Like this is a warmer black. So you can kind of show that there's warm light even if you're painting something that's black or white. And then if I wanted to make a colder black, I'd probably take that and just add a little bit more phthalo blue to it. And this is how black pigment gets made. If you ever notice, if you mix black in with a red paint or black in with a yellow paint, if you mix it in with a red, you're gonna get kind of like a violet color. And if you mix black in with yellow, you're gonna get a green. And that's because blacks have a lot of blue pigment in them. So again, this is really important to remember because a lot of times whenever we're looking at something, it's very rarely in real life in full saturation. Like this orange is not at all like this bright. I'll make that a little easier to see. It is not that, right? And so you notice whenever I was using these color palettes over here, I was looking at how I could neutralize whatever orange I used. So when I had my yellow orange over here, I used green because it has blue in it to neutralize some of that orange and create a shadow, making it a little closer to what we're looking at here. Okay, and this is going to go into the very last thing I'm going to talk about today, and it'll wrap up our color theory notes. And this is going to be local versus relative color. So local color is going to be the nameable color. It's going to be the hue. So it's kind of the equivalent of me saying that this orange is orange. Okay, and then relative color is going to take into consideration how the context around the object is impacting the color. So it's not saying that this is just simply orange. It's taking that hue, but then also considering, you know, are there any tints or shades in there? Is it neutralized anywhere? Are there colors reflecting off of it? If you have multiple objects in a still life that you're painting, those are going to reflect off of each other. If I put this orange next to this white mug, the orange and white are going to reflect off of each other, and they're going to show in both of them. Or if I have, let's see, it's going to be hard to see in the camera, but if I hold this like little blue pool ball next to the orange, it's reflecting some blue onto the orange, and some of the orange is reflecting onto the blue here. So it's local color takes into account those reflections. It takes into account the temperature of the light. It takes into account saturation. Let me write all of these down real quick. So relative color takes context into account when mixing color. So considering saturation, so you know if there's any white, black, or gray added into that. Chroma. Reflections. Neutralization. And temperature of both the color and of the light. So, use this orange for example again. So, if I just say that this is orange, and I'm only going to paint it with orange, under the local color here. And so about all I can really alter here is my value. Where's the orange the darkest? Most saturated. And I will throw in just a little shadow here. And this is kind of the instinct whenever we're first learning how to paint. You know, you might have the instinct to maybe mix in a little bit of brown right here, because brown is close enough to orange that it doesn't feel scary. So then if we're painting with relative color in consideration, excuse me, I am still going to start off with my local color. I've got kind of a yellowish orange. And I'm going to start off just kind of establishing that as my base. Shape's a little wonky here. Okay, now I'm going to start looking for context. So, you know, this is the more neutral light setting that I have, but it is still on the colder side of light. And so if I want to show that this has some cool light on it, I'm going to get in here with a little bit of blue. And I am going to thin that blue out quite a bit with my water here. I don't want it to turn the whole orange blue. I just want to get the idea of cool light in here. Okay, so I've got where the light is really hitting the object. And then I'm also going to have a little spot where I've got a little bit of a cooler reflection here. Okay, and then with that light in consideration, I know I've got a warm shadow. It's kind of a warm purple. A little bit of umber in there. Then where the shadow lightens up a little bit here, goes into a little bit more of just brown. And is really close to kind of a true neutral in temperature here. So I am going to try to neutralize that brown a little bit. It's kind of like a orangey reddish brown, so I'm going to use a little bit more of a bluer green. And a little will go a long way in terms of impacting the temperature here. Halo shadow as well. Okay, I've got my warm cast shadow, and then I'm going to get my warm core shadow in here. Mix a little bit more orange in here. As far as oranges go, because there's so much green in there, it is kind of a colder yellowy orange. So I want to keep that into consideration as I'm mixing. And in this warm shadow, there's a spot that is really a little bit more red orange. And you can't see it from the camera angle, but actually the most like saturated orange spot is actually like right under here where we have the highlight. I'm gonna just get in here with that. Okay, and I've got a lot of cold yellow and greens up top here. So whenever you're painting from life and considering relative color, it starts to become a real conversation because you're always kind of responding to the last thing you did. It's going to be kind of a game of, is this lighter or darker? Is this more or less saturated? Is there any neutralization? Are there any reflections or colors I see in there that I didn't see before? Okay, and so then in adding a lot of these warms and cools, I've started to kind of lose that yellowy orange color. So I'm going to get back in here with some of that. Again, I promise demos and notes are not going to be this long for the whole summer semester. Just kind of that getting established, getting all of the information. After we get all of these notes down, it's really just going to be like 20-minute demos and instructions on projects, and then I'll be sending you on your way. It's going to take really slowing down and paying attention, because your brain wants to generalize this. Your brain wants to look at that and say, nope, that's orange. And I'm going back in and kind of reestablishing value in a few areas. There's some areas where got some reflected highlights down here. And this is usually about the point in a painting where I'm going to start to switch to a smaller brush just so I can start to get in some smaller areas. And I'm starting to use a little less water as I go because I do want to gain a little bit more control back. And post these, like after doing these notes, I am going to give you guys more than one assignment at a time so that you can kind of choose to be like, okay, I think this needs to dry because, you know, I'm not going to come back to these just for the sake of notes, but normally kind of this is a spot in a painting where I might take a little bit of a break and come back later. I am going to use a little bit of white here. It's where there is that reflected highlight kind of coming up and it's a little bit less saturated. And this is something where you could consider if you want to add a little bit of texture. Like I think that using the salt method could be great for kind of getting an orange peel texture. We're kind of playing around with some household items. Okay, and for the sake of notes, I'll stop here. I would probably keep going on a full painting, but I am going to take just a little bit to kind of crispen up that edge. I'm going to probably let it dry and get a little bit, some of the smaller details in there, but that should be plenty to get you started. So, you know, if you haven't been following along, go ahead and get started on these, and I will give you next assignment tomorrow. Have a good night.